On this episode of Be the Teacher, how your camera most likely works. Nowadays, most people have a cell phone camera, or if they're a professional, they may have a DSLR camera. In this episode, we will discuss the basics of DSLR, apertures, depth of field, and how this all relates to your cell phone. Taking a picture. The first item you will want to understand about a camera, specifically a digital single-lens reflex camera, or DSLR, is the lens at the front of the camera. Let's take a look at this picture. This first line traveling through the lens is going to be where the light travels until it hits what's called a reflex mirror. The mirror is actually going to help us see through the viewfinder so we can see what the lens sees. When you look through the lens, what you are actually seeing is the light reflected off of objects traveling through the lens, bouncing off the reflex mirror, bouncing up into what is called a pentaprism, off the pentaprism walls and through the viewfinder. Eventually, the image sensor, located behind the reflex mirror, will capture this image. In an older camera, or in a standard SLR, this is where the film would have been. The reason the image sensor is not exposed to the light is because of the reflex mirror and the shutter, which are in its path. Here on the left, you see the camera as it is before the moment of shooting, and on the right, you will see what happens when the shutter is depressed. At this moment, we cannot see the image through the viewfinder. The reflex mirror will fold up, allowing the shutter to open up and light to travel unobstructed through the shutter curtain. The light will now be able to hit your image sensor or film. This is where the exposure happens, and it is how your picture is taken. Once you let go of your button, your reflex mirror will descend, your shutter curtain will close, and you will once again be able to see through the lens because your reflex mirror and pentaprism will once again be bouncing light. This is how an image is captured. What is the aperture? The simplest explanation for aperture is simply an opening inside the lens in which light can shine through. The size of the aperture's opening is controlled by a set of overlapping metal blades called a diaphragm. This set of adjustable blades determines how much light hits the sensor at any given time. Just think of this opening like the valve handle of a water faucet. The wider you open the faucet, the more water pours out. Well, the wider the aperture opening, the more light pours into the sensor. To help adjust your aperture, you have what is called the f-stop or f-number. Now, this seems confusing if you try to do the math, but if you know the numbers, it is very easy to understand. The main thing that you do have to remember about the f-stop is that they are inverse values, which means that, like a fraction, the larger the number is, the smaller the diameter opening. So an aperture opening with a lower value, like f4, is larger than an aperture opening with a higher value like f8. In other words, a larger open aperture has a low f-stop number, while a small or closed aperture has a high f-stop number. This happens because you actually have to multiply by a factor of the square root of 2, approximately 1.41, and, well, you'll have to do the math. So, here's a diagram that shows you the full list of f-stops from F1 to F22. You can memorize it like I do. F1, F1.4, F2, F2.8, F4, F5.6, F8, F11, F16, F22. Remember, 1 is the largest opening and 22 is the smallest. And if you notice, you only have to memorize 1 and 1.4. Everything after that is pretty much a doubling of those two numbers. F1 becomes F2, F4, F8, F16, and F1.4 becomes F2.8, F5.6, and then it sort of gets rounded to F11 and F22. Remember, you bring in more light the lower the number of the f-stop. Depth of field. For filmmaking and photography, the aperture is primarily used to control depth of field. When we talk about the main characteristic of depth of field, we usually classify it into two categories: shallow depth of field and deep depth of field. Shallow depth of field is when we focus on a subject and the background is out of focus. And deep depth of field is when your picture is sharper and the items in front of the picture have a similar focus to the objects in the back of the picture. shallow or small depth of field. When the aperture is large, for example, f1.8, the area in front and behind the focus point is very slim or shallow. That means that objects in front are in focus while the background elements are going out of focus. As you can see in this photo, the flower arrangement in the foreground is in focus, but the flower arrangement in the rear quickly falls out of focus and the background is way out of focus. In film, shallow depth of field is used primarily to isolate the subject from its environment and make it appear separate from the elements around him, her, or it. For example, look at this picture of Daniel Craig in the movie Defiance. Notice how he stands out from the rest of the crowd from a shallow depth of field. Deep or large depth of field. When the aperture is small, for example f16, the image has a deep or large depth of field. This means that the focus range covers a large area. In this cityscape image, both the apartment buildings in the foreground and the skyscrapers in the horizon are both in focus. In film, large depth of field is most often used to show environment and a subject's relationship to his or her surroundings. Here, we can see an example of deep depth of field in a shot from the movie Playtime. Notice how the character in the front of the shot has a relationship with everything in the back of the shot, and it can all be seen clearly. Again, in the camera, the aperture controls the light and the depth of field. It is not the only way, but it is the easiest and most controllable way to manipulate depth of field with the aperture. And remember, smaller f-stop, the greater the blur in your background, and larger f-stop is going to show greater detail. In an advanced video, we would discuss the distance between you and the subject and focal length, both of which also have an effect on depth of field. You can see in this diagram here. But I would love to skip ahead to the idea of sensor size. By now you might realize that a good camera will allow you to create depth of field. This is something that every movie maker hopes to be able to capture. Using your camera to bring focus to an object through shallow depth of field or draw attention to a landscape through deep depth of field is an invaluable tool in the storytelling process. The size of the sensor plays a part in how much you will be able to accomplish. The smaller the sensor, the larger depth of field. And the larger the sensor, the shallower the depth of field. This is one of the reasons why you cannot get the shallow depth of field look from a point-and-shoot camera or from your cell phone. The sensor is simply far too small. Full frame or 35mm DSLRs have been the standard when it comes to creating the lovely shallow depth of field look, which is why they are often the preferred choice for professional photographers and for movie makers. The fact is, if we go back to f-stop and apertures, some smartphones have some amazing sized apertures for their size. A low f-stop means a wider aperture and more light, and some cell phones have an aperture of f1.7. That's pretty amazing. The issue is that the vast majority of top-tier smartphones use sensors that are about 1/3 of an inch. In terms of surface area, the 1-inch sensor in a nice point and shoot is more than 6 times bigger than any of the top smartphone camera sensors, while the sensor in a consumer DSLR is around 19 times bigger. And buy a pro-grade DSLR and the sensor is 50 times the size of that puny thing in most high-quality phones. This means smartphone sensors struggle to harness light. Glance at a smartphone photo, taken in low light, and compare it to one shot with a DSLR. It's no contest. Nonetheless, considering the limitations, the cameras in our phones are astonishingly good. Some, although they cannot capture depth of field, can now accomplish 4K resolution, which is the same resolution they use to film a show like Game of Thrones. To put it in the simplest terms, that means that the picture you look at is made up of about 4,000 little dots. Although a smartphone camera currently can't match the quality of a DSLR, they might not have to. Unless you are a serious or professional photographer, the smartphone camera is now a high-quality tool, and there are a ton of apps that can make a photo or video look just as good as a professional photographer or video maker. And the two approaches are complementary. Young filmmakers and photographers who are learning the craft can experiment with an affordable camera that can make everything from phone calls to edits. It's democratized the filmmaking process. And for right now, DSLR cameras take a better picture, and once a person knows that photography or filmmaking is something he or she wishes to pursue, he or she can make that investment. So that's it for this episode of Be the Teacher. You've learned about smartphone cameras and how they compare to DSLR cameras. You've learned about depth of field, both deep depth of field and shallow depth of field. You've learned about apertures and f-stops and how the numbers work. And you also learned how a DSLR camera takes a simple picture. So that's it for this episode. I hope you're ready to grab your camera, to go out and to take some great pictures or make some amazing movies. And we'll see you next time on Be the Teacher.